Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. It's Thursday, August 14th, 2025, episode 464, and we're going to talk about exploitation. Well, I love talking about exploitation when I used to teach at the university because it was one of those trigger words where people would love to cry exploitation, like, oh, this is exploitation, you're exploiting them, whatever. Not as much as it was 10 years ago, but nevertheless, exploitation is a favorite word for people to scream. But how do you know something is exploitative, right? So I would ask people, how do you know? And they said, well, because it's exploited, because someone else told me that it was, right? But what makes something exploitation? An example of exploitation. And after they struggled with it for a while, I said, well, it's force. If you're forced to do something, and once you say that, people are like, oh, yeah, yeah, that's right. If you're forced to do something, then that's exploitation, right? Because you have no choice. Like slavery is exploitation, right? You're forced to work and you're treated really poorly. So going by appearances, saying something looks like exploitation just doesn't cut it, right? And because there's so much subjectivity there, right? I wouldn't want to do that, but who's to say other people would make the same choice? And the favorite example that I would use, or the example that I would always use, is child labor. And so most people would agree that, these days that child labor is bad, right? And so it's really easy to get people on board and say, yeah, child labor is bad because it exploits kids. Okay, well, let's go over to Asia. Where there's lots of child labor, okay? And let's just say for one summer, our project for this class is to go shut down a child employing factory over in Asia. And let's just say we're successful and like we shut down a factory and we're so happy with ourselves and we think we've brought a little light into this dark world of exploitation. But really, what's really going on here, right? Most people, they look at the children and they say, why are they in school? Well, because schools are really, really expensive and these kids are all poor. In fact, if you shut down that factory, where are all the kids? They can't go to school because they can't afford it, right? They're not playing at home, right? Because they're too poor to play. So basically, what happens is a lot of them, they have to go back to the farm, which is backbreaking work outside. It's hot, it's miserable, but they're children, they have to work, or they have to be prostitutes, child prostitutes, right? And they're there to feed the appetites of everyone in the West, probably a lot of them on the Epstein file list, which doesn't exist apparently, but that's where they go. It's off-site to a different country where pedophilia is treated differently. And so basically, you're condemning a lot of these kids to go into child prostitution. And I would get these horrified looks by people. And I said, I don't know about you, as you are congratulating yourselves by condemning someone to child prostitution. If I was given the choice, I would choose working in that factory over child prostitution. Wouldn't you? And they all kind of were like kind of sheepish, right? They were like, oh my gosh, I thought I did something good. And really what I did was I made them more miserable. And so I said, in America, you don't have to go to Asia to find look for child exploitation. You can just find it here. So where's the closest? And this happens all over America, everywhere, right? So where can you find examples of child exploitation here in America? And everyone's stumped, right? They don't know. And then I said, just go find the nearest public school, right? The nearest public school, that is child exploitation. And it looks so different, right? That people don't even imagine that as being an example of child exploitation. But yeah, that's what it is because the kids are forced to go there through districting laws. And just basically truancy laws. If you don't go to school, then the parents are punished, right? What's her face? Kamala Harris would lock up parents for truancy violations, right? And she giggled, or cackled, whatever you want to say. She, was glad and happy and, sort of statistically happy for doing that. But if you examine the run-of-the-mill urban public school, they are horrible. there's very little education there. So the kids suffer, right? Uh, they're not really learning. So who does it benefit? It benefits teachers and the teacher unions and the bureaucracy, which gives them these privileges. So, in other words, the children are exploited for the benefit and for the sake of teachers and the teachers unions. Kids are forced to go there. And when you look at it that way, it's just like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Wow, that is crazy. So the child employing factories in Asia, they want to be there because they're making more money. And in America, we think education is so great, but actually we're exploiting children for the sake of teachers. Wow, so it's kind of a mind-bending experience for a lot of people. And just as a footnote, just want to insert it here. Anytime a politician uses or leverages kids to pass legislation, it's exploitation, right? They're using the kids for political ends, right? Which have nothing to do with the kids. In fact, which usually punishes children. So, for example, I was watching this video and the ad that came up before the start of the video was a pro gun control uh, commercial, right? So gun laws, right? Oh, we're doing it for the kids. No, you're not. You're putting them in a situation where they are more vulnerable, right? Gun-free zones. And the simple solution, and there is no one solution, right? But the simplest way to address this phenomena of school shootings is you just have to put the liability on the principal or the superintendent, right? That if there is a school shooting and it's a result of negligence on the part of the principal or the superintendent, well, then they have to be punished, right? Because they were charged with protecting the kids. And so now that the superintendent or the principal, all right, they know that they are responsible, they're liable, they're going to look for the best solutions. And you're going to find really creative solutions. You're going to have the normal brute force solution. You're going to have expensive solutions. You're going to have Gucci solutions, and then you're going to have solutions that actually work, right? Uh, and keep in mind, too, that this liability will probably stretch across not just physical safety, but future safety, right? Because a lot of the shootings that happened a couple of years ago were the result of what was taught in the years they were going to that school or what another school taught them. And so then they went and did violence because they were mentally unstable in the first place. But that's what happened. And so if you are superintendent, if you're the principal and you say, this is what we're going to teach, then you got to be responsible for the blowback if it's directly tied to that. I think somehow, right? Like if you're teaching hate, if you're teaching targets for people, then I think there should be some liability for that, right? Like you can't say, well, I don't like what you teach, and so therefore I'm going to come after you. No, it where they're specifically telling you these people are evil, you have to go after them. Then there should be some sort of some sort of accountability. Not not as bad as, of course, the keeping your school safe from shootings. But anyway, I hope you get the idea of what I mean. Once you realize that, oh, there are future implications from what I even say, the policies that I hold, well, then now it's a different story. And of course, it's a different way of thinking about things, right? No one thinks like that, as a matter of fact. That's why legislators can pass any kind of crazy bill and never have to worry about all of the failure that it will result in. Okay. And so so unless we do that, we're basically forced to pay for failure, right? We're being charged to pay for failed ideas, for basically failure, right? Market failure might be something that people might call it. So basically, taking a step back, being forced to provide benefit to other people, by threat of violence is exploitation, right? Do this or else something, right? So you're forced to do something to to work or to provide benefit to create value for someone else, but you're only going to do it because you're threatened with violence. That's exploitation. Well, taxation, right? Taxation is theft. Of course, we know this, but it's theft. It's excuse me, it's exploitation. right? We're being exploited, right? For the sake of the politically connected, for the state, for the sake of the state, the government. So, for example, taxes are used for public schools to pay off special interest groups, right? To reward people without there being a commensurate benefit for that reward, right? In other words, kids are not getting educated. So why are we still paying them, right? Taxes are extracted for policies that most people in the US reject. For example, war, like the vast majority, the overwhelming majority of people in the United States are anti-war, but somehow we're always in war. And war is expensive and it's paid for by our taxes. Taxes are extracted to pay for bureaucrats, right, who work to take from us, right? All the they ignore why they were voted. Once they get into office, they go to DC. They're either threatened, extorted, bribed, whatever, to go along with the system, to go along with the swamp, right? And so uh, they're paid and they're paid to take from us, right? While ignoring us and then telling us that we shouldn't complain about all of the exploitation that's being done to us. Taxes fund horrible scientific research, right? My kids were telling me the other day, Lyme disease is a government disease, government produced disease, right? They were experimenting with it and then it got out of the lab, infected a bunch of ticks, and now we have to deal with Lyme disease. The whole corona thing, cerveza, right? That was a government funded scientific research that got out of a lab in China. And there were at least six. At one time, I heard 12 similar biolabs in the Ukraine, many of which the Russians were able to take over. Right? We're paying for all this horrible, horrible stuff. In other words, we're not paying for cancer research. We're paying for biological warfare. I mean, who would in their right mind would actually pay for that? Very, very few, if any. Retirement accounts and insurance companies are required to buy treasuries for security because supposedly they're the best collateral. But we know I did an episode on how US treasuries are no longer AAA rated. In fact, some people say that it's junk bond status. And junk bond basically means they're not very reliable. But junk bonds, at least, so they're worse than junk bonds because junk bonds usually have a really high interest rate to pay for the risk, right? The fact that you might not get anything at all. And so to entice people to lend you money, you got to have a high interest rate, right? It's what is it? Loan sharks in reverse, right? So the government is borrowing from us. And we're supposed to be the loan shark, right? By having this high interest rate. So it makes you want to rethink loan sharks, the propaganda surrounding that. But anyway, that's for another episode, I guess. But US Treasuries are no longer AAA rated. They're not trustworthy. They're not reliable, right? But people are forced to buy them to fund the government, right? So the US government has to continually sell more and more treasuries because they're spending more money, right? And so to justify the spending, they got to borrow more money. That's how where the money comes from. They're borrowing it. But no other country in the world wants to lend US money anymore, right? Because they could sanction you, they could take it from you, they could, invalidate them, whatever. And so US is not trustworthy. And so therefore, countries don't want to lend to the United States any longer. And so what they have to do is they have to turn to the American people. And so insurance companies, retirement accounts, any of these kind of savings vehicles that people have set up in the times of plenty, well, they're being raided now by the government to fund government activity, which works to the benefit of political insiders, bureaucrats themselves, and the corrupt wealthy, right? The crony capitalists, right? The people who are connected with government and they're making money hand over fist. In fact, a lot of them, what they're doing is they're bailing on treasuries, but they need other people to buy them from them so they can redeem as much of the original value as possible. And so they dupe the Joe Schmo common citizen like you and me while they get out while they still can, right? Right, because once the value of the treasuries is openly valued, like the value is marked to market, and you realize they can't get all of their initial investment back. Well, whoever is left holding the bag, they're the ones who's going to suffer. And so the connected political insiders are unloading all of this bad debt on the taxpayers, right? And so, so it's exploitation, right? We're being forced to buy them. Meanwhile, you'll know that China is pushing their insurance companies to own gold because it's extremely liquid. It doesn't lose its value. It's always going to be gold. And so it's much more reliable as an asset as opposed to US treasuries, right? So in the United States, we're being pushed to buy more treasuries, which are not holding its value, which are losing value. And China, they're going to gold, right? That's just thought I'd throw that in there as well. So uh, we've borrowed so much money that future generations are being taxed, right? They don't even exist yet, and they're being taxed, right? So we're stealing from our descendants. We're exploiting our descendants who aren't even born yet. Bank bailouts from the 2008, all right, they're coming back to haunt the system, right? Were forced to bail out the wealthy bankers, right? So they got away without losing much at all, and the rest of us, we got more national debt, right? So it's insane how this is going. So any call to increase taxes, especially by those socialists type, right, is really a call to bail out the rich, right? Increase taxes so we can bail out the rich, whether you want to or not. And I'm pretty sure most people who are mindlessly saying tax the rich, they don't realize that they're actually saying bail out the rich. that's but that's really essentially what's going on, a wealth transfer. Lots of other people have talked about it, but right, it's a wealth transfer that's going on, right? And since we are paying this, we're basically paying for failure and exploitation. We're paying for our own exploitation. It's so insane, right? So we're paying the government that's failing, right? Getting deeper in the hole, and we're helping to dig it, right? So not only are we being exploited, but we're digging our own grave, and it's fast becoming a bottomless pit. So how do we get out? How do we start filling that hole? Well, you end the Fed, end the money printing, right? Stop that ability to borrow money to create credit, to create currency, right? So by ending the Fed, we end the tax of inflation, right? The devaluation of our currency. Anything short of that, right? To do anything else, whether it's a gold-backed 100-year treasury bond, which apparently a lot of people are very skeptical of it already. Yeah, it's not going to work, right? You just have to end the Fed. And once you do that, or you begin to start to see, it's sort of what Doge was doing, Department of Government Efficiency. People began to see where their taxes were going, why they were paying all of these taxes, right? Most people would say, well, I want children to be helped. That's why I don't mind paying higher taxes. And then you realize you're not paying taxes for the kids. You're paying taxes for war, for assassinations and subversion. You're paying for The View, for Stephen Colbert, right? That's what you were paying for. And a lot of people would scoff at the idea of doing that, right? Um, so by ending the Fed, you actually see where the taxes are going, right? Who's benefiting from it. And let's see, it punishes people who overspend, right? So if by spending too much, right, they're taking it out of their own holdings and their assets, right? Whether it's in the future or in their present, right, by all this debt. And as I said, it's a big wealth transfer scheme. So freedom always beats the centralized planning, especially the centralized planning of banks, right? So really, if the more free we are, the more that people cannot exploit us, the more that we are living under their control, under their rules, the more that we are exploited, right? So the more you understand that having no choice and being forced to do something, that is exploitation. It changes the way that you see the world. It changes even your morality, right? What you think is good and bad. Like a lot of people after my class began to realize that little kids working in a factory, if that was their ticket, that was their way to having a better life, then what are you doing opposing it? So it does shake your sense of morality of what you think is good and bad, right? And this is what's good, to get you constantly thinking that if you are going to continue to say, yeah, we got to shut down all those factories that employ children, at the very least, you're going to try to figure out an alternative, right? If you shut down the factory, what are you going to give them instead, right? What other options are there? And it's a pretty tough answer, right? It's a pretty tough to come up with a solution in that situation, but at least now you're going into a better direction. So freedom for them, freedom for us means less exploitation in the world, and that is a good thing. That's it for this episode. I will talk to you next time.